Hello everyone, and welcome to lesson 3 of our second module. Gosh, we are moving at such speed, I almost can't believe it. Without states, your React components are just glorified static templates, so that's why we've devoted a lesson to show you how you can make React more interactive by using states. Well, I do hope you're all as excited as I am, because today we're going to understand the concept of states and props and how they're going to allow you to build really interesting applications. And the objectives for today's lesson will be to explore React component states, and then look at states versus properties, and then finish off with distinguishing between stateful and stateless components. I don't know about you, but I'm ready to get cracking. And for our next lesson after this, we're going to get a better idea of React component lifecycle events. We're going to understand the different event categories. We will define an event and learn about mounting, updating, and unmounting events. Alright, let's kick off and let's take a look at states and interactions in components, because to be honest with you, static components are a bit dull. We're going to talk about the different ways to declare a component and how to keep components composable and reusable. I reckon the obvious place to start here is to clarify what React component states are. Imagine you're building an autocomplete input field. When you type it in, you want to request that the server fetches information about matches to show on the web page. And we've already learned that by changing properties, you can get different views. But properties can't change in the context of the current component, because they are passed on this component's creation. Let me put it another way. They are immutable in the current component, meaning you do not change properties in this component unless you recreate the component by passing new rules from a parent. But you must store the information you receive from the server somewhere and then display the new list of matches in the view. So how do you update the view if the properties are unchangeable? One solution is to render an element with new properties each time you get the new server response. Then you will have to have logic outside the component. The component stops being self-contained. Clearly, if you can't change the values of properties, the autocomplete needs to be self-contained. You can't use properties, so you use states to update the views in response to events without recreating a component. Once the response from the server is ready, your callback code will augment the component state accordingly. You'll have to write this code yourself. React will intelligently update the view for you, only in the places where it needs to be updated. That's where you use the state data. States are the core concept that lets you build React components that can store data and automatically augment views based on data changes. With React component states, you can build meaningful, interactive React applications. A React state is a mutable data store of components, self-contained, functionality-centric blocks of UI and logic. And by the way, if you haven't already worked this out already, mutable means that the state values can change. By using state in a view and changing values later, you can affect the view's representation. If you think of a component as a function that has properties and state as its input, well then the result of this function is the UI description. To work with states, you access them by name. This name is an attribute of the thisState object. React takes care of keeping views up to date when the state is used in the view's changes. In essence, when the state changes, only the corresponding parts of the views change. Everything else in the DOM remains intact. This is possible due to the virtual DOM, which React uses to determine the delta using the reconciliation process. To be able to work with states, you need to know how to access values and update them and set initial values. Let's start off with accessing states in React components. The state object is an attribute of a component and can be accessed with this reference. You will recall that you can access and print variables in JSX with curly brackets, and very similarly, we can render the thisState variable or custom component class attribute in render, like this. This syntax is similar to the way that we access properties with this prop's name. Let's use what we've learned so far to implement a clock. The goal is to have a self-contained component class that everyone can import and easily use in their application without having to jump through hoops. The clock must render the current time. Because time is always changing, you need to update the view using state and give it the name current time, like this. You will get an error, uncaught type error, cannot read property, current time of null. Normally, JavaScript messages are about as helpful as a glass of cold water to a drowning man. It's kind of good that in this case, JavaScript at least gives us a helpful message. That message is basically saying that you don't have a value for current time. Unlike properties, states aren't set on the parent, and you can't set state in render either because it'll give you a circular loop like this. And in this case, React will throw an error. So far, you've seen that before you use state data in render, you must initialize the state. To set the initial state, use state in the constructor with your ES6 class React component syntax, and then pass your initial state, like this. We can also add other logic whilst you're setting in the initial stage. For instance, you can set the value of current time using new date. You can even use toLocalString to get the proper date and time format of the user's location, like this. The value of state must be an object. Here, current time is an arbitrary name. You'll need to use the same name later when accessing and updating this state. You can name the state anything you want, as long as you refer to it later using this same name. The state object can have nested objects or arrays. This example adds an array of my books to the state. Do you see that we can set state directly by using state just once? Avoid setting and updating state directly with this state equals anywhere else, because doing so may lead to unintended consequences. And you might be asking, what's the point of a clock that doesn't show the time correctly? Well, luckily, there's a way to update the state. And did you know, React components have a built-in state object. The state object is where you store property values that belong to the component. When the state object changes, the component re-renders. Now let's talk about updating states. We can change state with the thisSetState class method. When this method is invoked, React merges the data with current states and calls render. After that, React calls callback. Having the callback in setState is important because the method works asynchronously. If you rely on a new state without waiting for setState to finish its work, that is, work synchronously with an asynchronous operation, well then you may have a bug whilst you wait for the new state values to be updated, because the state is still an old state with old values. Let's go back to implementing a clock example. So far, we've rendered the time from a state. We also set the initial state, but you need to update the time every second, right? And to do so, you can use the browser timer function setInterval, which will execute the state update every n milliseconds. The setInterval method is implemented by virtually all modern browsers as a global, which means you can use it without any libraries or prefixes, like this. We can use setState anywhere. setState is called from the event handler or as a callback for incoming data or data updates. Changing a state value in your code using this state name equals new name won't trigger a re-render and a possible real DOM update, which you want. For the most part, please note that changing state directly without setState is an anti-pattern and should be avoided at all costs. It's also important to note that setState updates only the states you pass to it, partially or merged, but not a complete replace. It doesn't replace the entire state object each time, so if you have 3 states and you change one, the other 2 will remain unchanged. In this example, user email and user ID will remain intact. If your intention is to update all three states, then you need to do so explicitly by passing the new values for these states to setState. As mentioned earlier, you can access the state object with this state. And as you may recall, you output values with curly brackets in JSX. So therefore, to declare a state property in this view, that is, render a return statement, you would apply this. React magic happens when you use state data in a view, for example, to print in an if-else statement or as a value of an attribute, or as a child's property value, and then give setState new values. React updates the necessary HTML for you. You can see this in your DevTools console. It would show cycles of updating and then rendering, and the best part is that only the absolute minimum required DOM elements are going to be affected. States and properties serve different purposes, but both are accessible as attributes of the component class, and both help you to compose components with a different representation or view. One of the primary differences between states and properties is that the former are mutable, whereas the latter are immutable. Another difference between properties and states is that you pass properties from parent components, whereas you define states in the component itself, not its parent. The philosophy is that you can only change the value of a property from the parent and not the component. So properties determine the view upon creation, and then they remain static. They don't change. The state, on the other hand, is set and updated by the object. Not all components need to have state. Now, in the next section, you'll see how to use properties with stateless components. A stateless component has no states or components or any other React lifecycle events or methods. The purpose of a stateless component is just to render the view. The only thing it can do is to take properties and do something with them. It's a simple function with the input or properties and the output, the UI element. The benefit of using stateless components is that they are predictable. Because you have one input, that determines the output. Predictability means that they are easier to understand, maintain, and debug. In fact, not having a state is the most desired React practice. The more stateless components you use, and the fewer stateful ones you use, the better. For example, Hello World is a stateless component. In a stateless component, you can't have a state. And you might be wondering, why would you use stateless components rather than stateful ones? They are more declarative and work better when all you need to do is render some HTML without creating a backing instance or lifecycle components. Basically, stateless components reduce duplication and provide better syntax and more simplicity. All you need to do is mesh together some properties and elements into HTML. Our suggested approach, and the best practice according to the React team, is to use stateless components instead of normal components as often as possible. But as you saw in the clock example, it's not always possible. Sometimes you do have to resort to using states. There are a handful of stateful components on top of the hierarchy to handle the UI states, interactions, and other application logic, such as loading data from a server. And a point to note, don't think that stateless components must be static. By providing different properties for them, you can change their representation. Okay, so let's return to our code for a clock and look at an example that refactors and enhances it. The code for clock renders the two child elements and passes the time property with the value of the current time state. The state of a parent becomes a property of a child. If we take a look at this example, the clock has two ways to show time: analog and digital. Now you need to create digital display, which is simple. It's a function that takes the properties and displays time from that property argument, props time, as shown here. Usually when React developers say stateless, They mean a component created with a function or fat arrow syntax. It is possible to have a stateless component created with a class, but this approach isn't always recommended because it's too easy for someone else, or you in 6 months, to add a state. Don't be tempted, let's not complicate code. And you might be wondering whether a stateless component can have methods. Obviously, if you use classes, well then the answer is yes, they can have methods. But as I mentioned, most developers use functions. However, you can attach methods to functions. And the time has arrived for a demonstration. So in this demo, we're going to speak about states and props, which is properties in shorthand, and look at the difference between them. We're going to create stateless and stateful components, and we'll look at when we can use them. So now let's answer some questions with examples. What are props, and what is the state, and should I use props or state? And what impact do they have? And what's the difference between props and state? So props are short for properties, and props allow us to pass custom data to the React component. So for example, I'll open up our previous example, so that's inside the src folder. And I have our main component app.js. So now let's write some examples of props. Over here, if I come just after the welcomes components and write to input, and I'll pass some properties, so first name equal username. And then the second property, the placeholder equal. Placeholder equal. I'm going to call it enter your name. I'll close the input and I'll add another input for age, and I'll pass two properties. For the first property, the first one is age equal age. And the second property is a placeholder for that input, and then I give it a value of enter your age. And then close the input. I'll save this file and I'll open the terminal to run the application. And now I'm inside the folder React.js and I'll change the directory to my app. And then hit enter, and then I'll write npm start to start the application and then hit enter. And then I'll say yes. And this will open the application in Google Chrome browser. So if you can see over here, we have our two input fields. The first one for the name and the second one for the age. And each one has its own property. For the first one, we have a name and placeholder. And for the second one, we also have age and placeholder. So that's how we write properties in React component. So all the attributes, name, age, and placeholder are all props. But why are props important? React applications are formed by composing different components. And there are two types of components. Stateful components, we also call them class components, and stateless components, and we call them function components. But what is a state? Well, a state is a closure variable, which is used for communication within a component. Having said that, a stateful component manipulates this state using setState function to modify the behavior of a component. When this internal state is passed to the other component using props, it becomes a stateless component. Let's create our stateless component, which I will call display details component. First, I'm going to create a folder. So I'm going to right-click, new folder, and I'm going to call it components. Components, and inside this component, I will put all the components that I want to create. I just right-click, new file, and I will call my first component displaydetails.js. So, I'm going to create a stateless component by using const, our component name displaydetails, equal, then props, then the fat arrow, and open curly brackets. And inside this, I want to return some data, so I'll wrap this in a div. And then inside that div, I will return an h1 of, say, props usage. And then I also want to return an h3 of, say, name is, then I'll use the props to return some data. So I'll type props.firstName. And then props.lastName. And I'll save this file, and I'll go to our, well, let's export this first, and I'll export the default component display details. So here I just export default display details. Alright, so now I'll save this file and I'll go to our component app.js. And then after the two inputs, I just want to call display details. So for that, I will write display details and then close this component, and then we can export. Or Visual Studio Code automatically imports the display details from the location, which is great. So it's from components and from display details components. So now what we have to do is pass some properties that we are using over here. So we have a first name and last name, and we'll go to our app.js, and inside the display details, we write first name. First name equal, and we will pass any name that we want to see in the screen. So we will write, let's say, Adam, for example, and then we pass the second property, which is the last name. So last name equal, let's say John. I'm feeling creative today, so let's say John. And then save the file and check. Here you will find props usage rendered first. Then my name is Adam John. And take a look at what's happening here. The app.js will take these two properties and pass them to the display details component. So here, the display will come and render first props usage, and then we'll go down over here and write my name is, then props.firstName. Here it will go to the parent component and render the first name and the last name. So it will type, my name is John Adam, or Adam John, because first name is Adam and last name is John, and that's the way that we pass data between components. The display's details is a stateless component which receives custom data through props, first name and last name. Props enable us to create stateless components, which are dumb UI components. On the other hand, the state is used to create container components, or stateful components, and that perform additional data manipulation and validation, which is then passed to dump components, or stateless components for display. And that's how we use props. So then, what's the difference between state and props? Props are immutable, while state is observable, and props pass to a component that can never be modified. However, the state of component can be changed using this .setState. State also can only be used in class components, and props have no such limitations. State is only available in class components because a class component extends class component from React, which makes the React state available to the component. Props, on the other hand, require no such need. Hence, they can be used with either function or class components. So let's review what stateful and stateless components are in React, and how you can tell the difference, and the complex process of deciding whether to make components stateful or not. Stateful and stateless components have many different names. For example, we call stateful components containers, and we call stateless components, or the functional component, presentational components. The literal difference is that one has a state and the other doesn't. That means the stateful components are keeping track of changing data, whilst stateless components print out what is given to them via props, or they always render the same thing. Alrighty, so let's have an example of a stateful component. So I'm going to create two components inside the components folder. The first one I'm going to call books.js. And this is going to be stateful component. So first we need to import React, and because it's class component, we need to import component from React. And then refining our class component, class books, extends component. And then defining our state. And in the state I will call books, and it's going to be an array of books. So the first book is React.js. And the second one is Learning React.js. And the last one, Learn React Hooks. So now we've defined our state. Then I will call the render method. And inside the render, I will return. So here I will return another component. I'm going to call it books list. And inside this component, I will map through the state of books and then bring them to the screen. So I'll call it books list. And here I need to pass the books property. Which is going to be this .state.books. And because I used books here, so this name needs to be the same name I'm calling it here. So then I will close this one and I need to import that component. So for the last thing, let's export default books. And we don't need, so let's save this file and export. Yep, so we get an error over here. Export default books. I will save this component and then I will go to create. So don't worry about books. This is not defined because we are going to create it in just a second. So I'll go to my component folder and new folder or new file. And I'll create the second component. I'm going to call it bookslist.js. And this is going to be a stateless component, or functional component. So let's define const books list equal and it will get properties, and these properties is, I'm going to call it books. And then type the fat arrow function. And then here I will return unordered list. And inside that unordered list, I want to return, I will map first in the new books array, .map, and then for each book inside of that. So I'm going to type book, and for each book, I want to return a list of that book. So now let me save this. Here we don't need parenthesis because we are returning one thing, and we don't have to write the double parenthesis, and then we need to put curly brackets here and close it in this area, and then save the file. So curly brackets. Okay, so what's happening here is we are returning the book from the books array. And after that, we will export default the component's name, books list, and then save the file. And so what's happening here inside the books.js component, we are rendering the books list. And from here, we are passing this .state.books. So this array will be passed from the books.js component, which is this component over here, to the books list component, which is over here. And then books list component will take that state and use it to map through it and then render these things to the screen. Now we have our two components ready, but we need to import the bookslist.js here inside this component, books component. So we're going to type in import books list from /books list. And then we just have one thing left, which is rendering books in our main component app.js. So after all of this, I want the book names to be rendered after these elements. So I will write books and close the tag, and we have to import it here as well. So close the tag, and then we have to import it over here. So I'm going to type in import books from. So now we need to go to /component, which is components folder /. So if you can see, we have books and books list and display details. All these inside our components folder. So for now, we need to import books. So when we save this file and check our Google Chrome, we will find our books are rendered to the screen. React.js, learning React.js, and learn React hooks. And that's the way that we pass data, with props between components. So we define our state first in our books.js component, right? And then we pass this state as a props to books list component. And we use books list component to map through that state and return each book in an unordered list. And we use our app.js component to wrap all the elements that we need to see on the screen. And that's the way that state props work. And notice the stateless component is written as a function. And as cool as states are, you should always aim to make your components as simple and as stateless as possible. So different components can be reused, like Lego pieces, I guess, even if you don't have an immediate plan to reduce a component. The stateful one, like the books.js component, should feel lucky to be so. Okay, so you might be asking, when should I make a component stateful or stateless? That's the big question. You probably won't know exactly how a component will turn out as soon as you start writing one. You generally figure it out as you go along. But there are some guidelines that you can think about before you start defining your component. So first off, type out or visualize your website as if it were one component. It's going to be busy, right? Break it down from there into smaller components. You will need state somewhere when information dynamically changes, like a user's current favorite song or top scores, and aim to have a parent component. Keep all the information and pass it down to its children, stateless components. So if you can say hello world and welcome to React, it's written in our main app.js component, and the two input fields are coming from display details component, and the books are coming from books and books list components. And that's it for the tutorial. I'll catch you back in the lesson. So you've seen that without states, your React components are just glorified static templates. We've touched on some of the difference between states and props. Your task to complete after this lesson is to do some more research of your own and come up with differences between the two. And we'll touch base on this at the start of the next lesson, just to see if you're all on track.